Have you ever looked at an old map and seen a country that just isn't there anymore? Well, if you look at a map of Europe from about 40 years ago, you'd see a big country in the southeast called Yugoslavia. Look at that same spot today, and it's gone. So that's the big question, right? How does a whole country just vanish? It's not some kind of magic trick. It's a really powerful story about people, about politics, and about what happens when the things that hold a nation together just fall apart. So let's get into it.
Okay, so to understand how Yugoslavia broke apart, you first have to understand what it was. For most of its existence, it was one unified country, but it was incredibly diverse. A real mix of cultures and identities all in one place.
Yugoslavia was basically a federation made up of these 6 republics you see here. Think of them like states. And within these republics, you had all these different ethnic groups: Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, and different religions too, like Orthodox Christianity, Catholicism, and Islam. For a long time, it kind of worked, but those very differences would eventually be used to tear the country apart.
Now, for over 35 years, the person who held this complicated place together was one man, President Josip Broz Tito. He was a really strong leader who, after World War II, managed to unite everyone under this single banner of being Yugoslav. He ran a communist country, but he was famous for doing it his own way, totally separate from the Soviet Union. And under his rule, things were pretty stable. But he was also very strict about crushing any signs of division.
But then, in 1980, Tito died. And with him gone, that central pillar holding everything up was just gone. All the problems that had been bubbling just beneath the surface for years finally started to explode.
Pretty quickly, the country got into some serious economic trouble. It owed huge amounts of money to other countries. Inflation went through the roof, which means the price of everyday stuff like food was just skyrocketing. A lot of people lost their jobs. And on top of all that, the richer republics like Slovenia and Croatia started getting really resentful that their money was being used to support the poorer ones. People were angry, and they were looking for someone to blame.
And this is where things took a really dangerous turn. With everyone so frustrated about the economy, some politicians saw their chance. They started using nationalism to grab power. So what is nationalism? It's basically this belief that your own ethnic group, being a Serb or a Croat, for example, is way more important than being part of a big, mixed country like Yugoslavia. These leaders started blaming other ethnic groups for all the problems, and it worked.
And you can see exactly what happened next. That shared idea of being Yugoslav just started to disappear. People's identities shifted. Instead of seeing themselves as citizens of the same country, they started thinking of themselves as Serbs or Croats or Bosniaks first. And just like that, neighbors who had been friends for their whole lives started to view each other with suspicion.
So you've got a failing economy and this rising tide of nationalism. The country was at its breaking point. The whole idea of Yugoslavia was crumbling, and the individual republics were ready to go their own way.
This timeline really shows how fast it all happened. After Tito died in 1980, things started to fray. But the real moment of no return was in 1991. That's when 2 of the republics, Slovenia and Croatia, officially declared they were leaving Yugoslavia and becoming independent countries. That was the spark that lit the whole thing on fire.
But these first 2 breakups played out very differently. In Slovenia, the fighting was actually really short. It was over in just 10 days, and the Yugoslav National Army pulled out. But Croatia, that was a whole other story. You see, Croatia had a large Serbian minority that didn't want to leave Yugoslavia. This led to a full-blown, devastating war that lasted for years.
But the conflict that was the most brutal, the most tragic of them all, was in Bosnia and Herzegovina. When it declared independence in 1992, the war there became incredibly violent. Why? Because it was the most ethnically mixed republic of all, with large populations of Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats all living together. Its capital city, Sarajevo, was put under siege for almost 4 years. It was just a nightmare.
As the world watched all of this horror unfolding on the news every night, the international community finally decided it had to do something to try and stop the fighting and help the innocent people who were caught right in the middle of it. So, the United Nations sent in soldiers called peacekeepers. You could always recognize them by their distinct blue helmets. Now, their job wasn't to fight in the war. They were supposed to be a neutral force, delivering food, medicine, and protecting civilians. The problem was, their roles often prevented them from actually using force, so they struggled to stop the fighting. The big breakthrough finally happened in 1995. In a pretty unusual move, American diplomats flew the leaders of all the warring sides to an Air Force base in Dayton, Ohio. The idea was to get them far away from the conflict so they could negotiate a deal. And after weeks of intense talks, it worked. They signed the Dayton Peace Agreement, which finally ended the war in Bosnia. It wasn't a perfect deal, but it stopped the killing. But even after the war in Bosnia ended, the region was still incredibly tense. In 1998, another conflict erupted, this time in Kosovo, a part of Serbia with a majority ethnic Albanian population that wanted independence. This led to another international intervention when the military alliance NATO launched airstrikes in 1999 to force Serbian troops out. This was really the final major chapter of the Yugoslav Wars.
So, after nearly a decade of brutal warfare, the fighting was finally over. The country of Yugoslavia was gone for good. But what was left? What's the legacy of this country's violent collapse?
Well, where there was once one country, there are now 7. Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Kosovo. The map was completely redrawn.
And for these new countries, the road to recovery has been incredibly long. I mean, they had to rebuild everything. Cities, bridges, roads. They had to create brand new governments from scratch. International courts were set up to prosecute people for war crimes. But maybe the hardest part, the part that's still ongoing, is the human recovery. Rebuilding trust in communities where neighbors had turned on each other.
And really, that's the biggest takeaway here. The story of Yugoslavia is more than just history. It's a powerful warning. It shows how easily a country can be torn apart when people in power use fear and nationalism to divide everyone. Understanding how it happened is so important if we want to make sure tragedies like this don't happen again.
So all of this leaves us with a really tough question, and it's one that people all over the world are still grappling with today. After so much hate and so much violence, what does it actually take for people to rebuild trust and learn to live together again? It's something worth thinking about.